Do 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 dum dum do 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 dum dum stream.me. That's where I'm going. Beep 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 boop 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 boop. Oh hey, I am live. So, today I was going to talk about a little bit about science, a little bit about climate change, a little bit about history. There's a fantastic book. There's only one fantastic book. I don't know if you've heard of it. Actually, there's a lot of fantastic books. But the book I'm thinking of, which you may or may not have heard of, which you probably have not, I don't think it's all that popular, is called The Process of a Scientific Revolution. It's by Thomas Kuhn. And Thomas Kuhn was this guy that was more interested in history, from what I understand and what I remember. He was more interested in history, and he had a unique perspective on science. But anyways, he kind of describes how history has been for science. He doesn't really make claims of like good, bad. He doesn't say how it should be. He's not prescriptive. He's descriptive, if I remember correctly. But the first place I was introduced, well, I've heard of this book. I've heard of it since I was fairly young. My family, my parents liked Franklin Covey's books on, like his book, Seven Habits of Highly Effective Planners, or Highly Effective People. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think is his book. Anyways, but there's like a Covey planner, I think, that I remember when I was little, that's what my mom used as her like day planner type of thing. And anyways, Covey, he referenced this concept, and he talks about a paradigm shift. And that term paradigm shift, I believe the term itself, but that idea comes from Thomas Kuhn in in this book. A long way of saying it's a good book. Is that a cat? It's either a cat or some kind of zombie raccoon. Bit creepy though. It's going funny stuff. Anyways, what was I at? I was babbling. Right. Okay, Thomas Kuhn. So, it's interesting. He breaks it down into 2 different stages. There's a stage, or phases, I guess is what he calls them. There's a phase called normal science and revolution. And to explain it more clearly, normal science is typically a relatively long phase. It goes through development, and it's done under a specific paradigm. Now, a paradigm is the way you view the world. In science, you could a theory or theories that you're using to match to the world. So you have these different theories, and you're using those to focus and try to explain the world around you as you observe it and as you see it and as you collect data and all that junk. So the interesting thing is, though, in this normal science phase, scientists aren't interested in finding right or wrong. They're not interested in proving the paradigm is true. They're interested in matching the data to the paradigm, collecting better data and rewriting little parts of that paradigm, adjusting that paradigm to fit the data that's collected. All paradigms have anomalies. An anomaly is something that is not, it doesn't fit in, like whether it's they have a data that's collected that doesn't match what the prediction shows it should be, or whether there's a phenomenon that they can't explain, something that happens that doesn't quite fit. All paradigms have those. And the role of scientists in while these paradigms are established, while you're in this normal science phase, is to fit is to basically make the paradigm fit better. And the effect that happens is when you have students that come into college, they learn a paradigm, and they learn heavily off of these textbooks that are up to date and written in this paradigm, and they're never taught to question the paradigm. The paradigm becomes a dogma. It becomes something that they protect almost religiously. And Kuhn, he does a very good job at not trying to discredit or belittle that, but just pointing it out and saying, "Hey, this is what happens." And as I was learning about this, the first place that I was really introduced to this idea and these concepts before I read his book was a philosophy of science class that I was in college. And this philosophy of science class went through and it talked about how the scientists should be doing science. And it was interesting because that doesn't happen. Like the scientists do science based off of their own whatever they want, really, and depending on how they're taught and depending on how they're peer reviewed. But that's really, it's almost a democratic process sometimes where they kind of keep each other in check. But if they're not honestly keeping each other in check, then it doesn't matter. You can get into different philosophers. There's some nuts guys out there. I'm looking at you, Paul Firebend. Anyways, the interesting thing about this paradigm idea is that the interesting thing to me as I was learning this is I've seen this, and I think it's more of a human trait. It's not necessarily isolated to science, because I've seen this in religion. I've been religious my whole life, and I've been heavily religion is a big part of my life. I've seen in my church, in other churches, I've seen people who don't necessarily understand why they believe what they believe or why they do what they do, but they're kind of following along without the base foundation. And that's a danger. That's a dangerous thing. So it isn't just in the science community, but while I was going to this class, another class that I was taking was a geology class. I remember, and this is a very, very perfect prime example of what Kuhn was explaining. So this geology professor that I had, I really enjoyed the professor. I think she was knowledgeable, she was sharp, she was one of the cutting edge scientists in her field. She was one of the co-authors of the idea of the snowball Earth phenomenon, which is fairly common or fairly popular in geology and in history. But so she's a fairly well-known geologist, and I saw her. We went on a was it a week long? I don't remember. Several days. We went on a field trip where we investigated rock formations in Moab, and it was pretty cool. But there was one day we were learning about carbon dating, and this professor, she wasn't there that day. She was out of town, and we had a student aide teaching that day, and the student aide was a decent person. She was knowledgeable in the field, but I remember asking her. So carbon dating, it uses if I remember correctly, and this has been a couple of years, but it uses carbon isotopes, and it rates the level of decay, and it's really quite accurate from what we understand. But that level of decay, it can be based off of radiation, the radiation at the time and the radiation over time. And that radiation is the question I asked about. And I said, and I remember learning in high school that the sun goes through different weather cycles. It goes through different. It has its own patterns, and it emits radiation not at a constant rate. And I asked, how would that affect the carbon dating system? Like how does that affect the results of what we're getting? And she viewed that as like me attacking the idea of carbon dating. I don't think that that's an original idea. I don't think it's even that clever. I think that it's just, I just didn't know. It was something that I saw, hey, this is probably a point where it's not going to quite match up. And this student teacher, this TA, or I don't know, whatever you call it, this grad student, she looked at me and she's like, haven't you ever heard of the scientific method? And she moved on. She didn't know how to respond to the answer that was outside of the paradigm that she was taught. And because of that, she felt, you could tell she was like offended and tried to belittle my response, or my question, and then moved on without answering the question at all. If the teacher would have been there, the teacher wouldn't, professor, she wouldn't have, I don't think she would have had a problem at all discussing it, or even saying, I don't know, because I've heard her say that to other questions that were happening. I don't know, we can find out. And she looked up information that she could, but she wouldn't BS you. She wouldn't pretend that she knew something she didn't. But this TA, maybe it was nerves that she was teaching, I don't know. I mean, but it was fairly obvious that she was not ready to cope with a question that didn't fall into her paradigm, that she was, the way that she viewed her field. And she wasn't even going to entertain it. And it was, at the time I was furious. I was ticked because I had already finished up. It was my last semester, and before I finished my bachelor's, I wasn't taking any of the classes that I was interested in, which was computer science. I finished in computer science. I'd done all those classes, and I had already gotten a job. I'd been working in the field for a couple years at that point. And I was just like frustrated. I was like, why am I paying to do this? Why, I was mad, and I just kind of just whatever, shook it off. But it was a clear representation of what Kuhn was explaining. Now, the revolution stage is relatively short, and it's a complete break in scientific tradition. So during this normal phase, you have a scientific tradition that's built up, and he breaks down, if I remember right, he breaks down the normal phase into different parts, where it's like you have a pseudoscience where you have an idea of what you think. With that pseudoscience, it develops in you, and it creates a better. You get scientists to more agree on what the actual paradigm is. They come to grips with what they believe is happening, and then that pseudoscience becomes kind of a more understood science. When scientists don't agree on the paradigm, I think, if I remember correctly, it has to be a pseudoscience. Things that I'm reading through some of the notes that I had in this as I'm going, just because it was interesting going through this. But there's mature sciences and immature sciences. Things that he went across as mature sciences would be like physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, and then the immature sciences would be sociology, psychology, political science, those things that are less tangible typically and harder to actually pinpoint. And if you look into psychology and look into there's so many different explanations that vary and contradict each other so vastly. If you look into physics, there's different explanations. You've got like Newtonian physics or Einsteinian physics versus quantum physics. Like you've got different variances, and those are each paradigms within that field, but they all are trying to explain. They don't contradict each other as much as something like Freudian versus Adler or whatever. I don't know. I don't remember. Psychology is not as. I've done a little bit of reading, but it's not my forte. The interesting thing that I wanted to that I kind of wanted to bring up, though, was how people are so fixated on climate change. Climate change has become a sacred cow in a sense. It's become one of those things that is used and taught religiously and as a dogma, and it's nothing more than a pseudoscience at best. I mean, I do believe that we should pay attention to the environment. We should try to keep the earth clean and try to keep pollution down and that kind of stuff. that's there. I think that most people, very few people, would promote actively destroying our environment. But the problem is, when you can control people's behavior, there's power there, and so people use the results of. Well, first let's get into kind of some of the results. One, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence or not artificial. Well, that's what I'm getting into. But computer science is one of the fields that, or is what I graduated in. That's where I'm actually. That's what I do professionally. Is I'm a coder, a software developer. But artificial intelligence is one of those things. Now you hear, oh, they created a model that matches the climate, and they created this, and we're gonna all explode. I don't know, whatever the danger is. Over the next 30 years, the Earth's temperature is going to raise 1.5%. I don't remember. I don't remember, and I don't care. Here's the thing about these models. And a model, just to be clear, a model is typically, unless I'm vastly wrong on this, which I don't think I am, a model is, I got to be careful because I'll probably, most likely will say something stupid. But a model is a structure that helps you to execute a function. So artificial intelligence uses models to make predictions, or to make classifications, or to make groupings. Those are the three main purposes of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence has been around since the 70s. It's not a new field. The thing that is new is we're getting computation to where it is caught up with algorithm, and that has opened up more ways to use use different algorithms in a up-to-date way, not up-to-date, in a practical way. You've got there's a channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown, or 3 Brown 1 Blue, I forget. He's a mathematician, and he does a very good job at putting together graphics and stuff about math. One of the things he went into is about neural networks. That's probably the most common form of artificial intelligence that's being used currently. And there's so many different types of neural networks. A neural network is basically a structure that is used to simulate the brain. It's loosely based off of how the brain works. And so I'll link why don't I just find it right now? I'll find it. Oh, I think I posted it to myself. Let me see if I did that. That would have been fantastic. Fantastic. But it's loading. Okay, where's Fred? There we go. Answers with Joe. And Joe's a good dude. Okay. Let me post it. This is Control C. I just posted it in the chat, which when I load this up to YouTube or wherever I load this, I don't know, I'll post it there too. But this guy, 3 Blue 1 Brown, he does a fantastic job at explaining exactly what a neural network is and how it's used. For simplicity's sake, a neural network is a network of small nodes. Nodes are they represent like your synapses in your brain, and the neural network takes a number of inputs and it has a possible number of outputs, and you go through and you start it randomly, but you take data that you know how it works, you know the results, and you train this neural network to find the correct answers based off of your training data. The first program that you do with a neural network is typically a neural network that'll read handwriting. So it'll read basically it'll decipher what letters you've written. But and that's what 3 Blue 1 Brown does. But the neural network, they vary based off of how many layers. So it takes specific layers. So you have an input layer where you put the information in, whether it's a picture, whether it's sound, whether it's data on the environment, whatever it is. You have a place to put input data. You have hidden layers that the data propagates from one layer to the other based off of what the value is. It changes whether it fires to the next layer, to the next node at the next layer or not. And so there's an arbitrary number of layers, and then you have an output layer, and that output layer is what you expected. So if you're trying to figure out the numbers 0 through 9, you would have 10 different nodes, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And most of the nodes, if the network's working and functioning correctly, most of the nodes, the output nodes, will be a very, very low number, and the number that it's expecting will be a very, very high number. And depending on what it is, that's a classification. But the thing is, when you've got a network that's working correctly and everything's functioning as it's expected, if you were to pause in the middle of its calculation and try and figure out what's going on, it's very difficult. It's nigh on impossible to do that. And the reason is because you have these nodes, and when I say nodes, it's typically you've got like a number, you've got a weight, and you've got a link to how it's weighted for each of the next inputs. And it doesn't make sense like why it works, but you can see that it works because of you train it. The professor that we had that taught us this about neural networks and about artificial intelligence in general is a lot of artificial intelligence, and this is not just to neural networks. This gets to genetic algorithms or neural evolution, or which is used to, anyways. A lot of it is you have a black box. You've created a structure that you know you can do something with, and then you have to fiddle with these dials to get the structure to do what you want it to. So you have to figure out kind of how to make it give you the results you want. And whether that's increasing the number of the width of the network, so how many nodes there are in each layer, whether that's increasing the number of hidden layers, whether that's increasing you have like convolutional networks now, and there's a lot of different stuff that they can do with them, but it's all just fiddling with the dials to try and get it to be correct. It works. They can get things very accurate, but it doesn't always work because of what you think. For instance, there was a research team that was creating a neural network that would take pictures of dogs and wolves, and they would, for these dogs and wolves, you would input a picture, and the way that it would tell you whether it's a dog or a wolf, and I think it even got as detailed as telling the species of dog. I don't remember exactly, but they were always having trouble with the huskies. And huskies look like wolves. You think, okay, that's understandable, but let's figure out exactly why. And so they did a deep dive, and they couldn't figure out at all. Huskies would sometimes be dogs and sometimes be wolves, and they had a really hard time figuring it out. And so what they did is they updated the neural network. They reprogrammed it so that it would tell them when they input the pictures, it would filter out everything that was of value to the network for that picture. So you would get a picture back that showed the important stuff that they were using to test that picture. The pictures that they would get back, there wasn't a dog in the picture. The only thing in the picture was the snow behind the dog. When it tried to figure out if it was a dog or a wolf, the data set that they had used to train this neural network, excuse me, the data set they had used was when a wolf was in the picture, more often than not, the wolf was in snow, and so it was the network was getting the right answers, but it was looking at the snow. It wasn't even looking at the dog. Excuse me. And so that's why it's very dangerous, because you can take a network that is working and functioning correctly, and it's giving you the right answers for all of your test cases, but it doesn't even look at what you're looking at. It's only trained on your test cases and how to get them working. When people come out and say we have these climate change reports that say if we don't do this, this, and this before, and they give a deadline, we're going to end up with catastrophe here, here, and here. Those models that they use to create they're accurate, but it's accurate to what? It's accurate to what? And the big problem is, and in my opinion, the huge red flag is when people use those in absolutes, and they try and use those to say something absolute when it's not that simple. It's not that cut and dry. It's not that clear. And any scientist, any true scientist that is seeking to figure out how the world works, that is trying to understand those things, they're going to honestly say that's not that simple, because the environment, this whole earth, we don't know. There's way too much that we don't know, and to pretend like we have definite solutions and definite answers and definite predictions, it's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. The thing that you can see for certainty is that it's used to control people with a zealotry that rivals even the most religious zealots. And it's interesting. We as people we're very we need to believe in things. We need to have a belief and a faith, and without that, we find things to believe in. It's really sad. I went to school in Utah, which is very religious. I went to a state school, but yet while I was on campus, if I were to mention religion, it was automatically assumed that you were dumb, or like you were stupid or naive. If you were to say anything about God or Christ, it's just like, oh, there's one of those guys. But yet we talk about climate change as if it were a certainty, and it's like, nah, it's still a pseudoscience. We're still collecting data. We definitely want to try and treat our environment well, but if people are doing more than just trying to treat our environment well, it's just it makes you so mad, makes you so frustrated. Useful idiots. Some people are just useful idiots. But you gotta love everybody. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion. They're also entitled to be wrong, and that's fine. There's this funny story. I was my dad does construction. He's a general contractor. He's been a general contractor since I was little. But I remember I was helping him do granite. I used to do granite countertops, and we were helping this lady out. She was remodeling, or I don't remember if it's a new home or what, but we were there working on the granite, and she had questions about this window, and it was a trim or painting or something like that, something that we weren't doing. It was just something that somebody else was doing, and there was an electrician there. It wasn't something he was doing either. And she asked an opinion. She's like, oh, should I do this or should I do this? And she was kind of a wishy-washy lady that she didn't know. And we all get that way. She was just in that stage of rebuilding your house that is like, oh, what should I do and stuff, and she got kind of emotional about it and was like, oh, should I do this? Should I do this? And I looked at what she was asking, and I could clearly see, in my opinion, what the best way to solve the problem was. And there was, and it was simple to me, is, oh, if you put an arch here or you do this, that will cover up the light and it'll do this. And there was a few different things that would have made it nice, from my perspective. And I looked at my dad, and he just was like, well, what do you want to do? And she's like, I don't know, I've thought of this. And my dad never gave an opinion, but he always was like, well, why do you think this? Why do you think this? And he never really gave an opinion, but he helped her look at her opinion. And then the electrician came in, and she asked him again as well. And he's like, oh, you should do this and do this and do this. And I looked at what that electrician was suggesting, and I thought it was the stupidest idea, because it was more difficult to do, or it was, and it just wouldn't finish it as nicely as what it could have been, in my opinion. And I looked at my dad, and he didn't do nothing. Like, he just kind of let the electrician talk, and afterwards I told him, I was like, you should have told her to do it this way and this way. And he's like, I know. My dad completely agreed with the way we both saw it from the get-go. We both have, I mean, he's built houses for years, and I've helped him with a few, and we both could see, like, yeah, that would be a nice way to finish that off. And he's like, I know, I could have said that. And I was like, why didn't you? And he said to me, he looked at me, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, my opinion doesn't matter. And I was like, I was in high school. No, I wasn't in high school. It was shortly after high school. At the time, I had been doing granite for, I think, 3 years, 2 or 3 years. I did it through high school and stuff. I don't know. But I looked at him, and I was like, wow. I was young enough and naive enough to still think that my opinion mattered on certain things. And I was like, he's like, this is her house. She's going to live in it for years. I don't want her to look at that and think, oh, if I would have done it this way, if I hadn't listened to that guy, and it's kind of like, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. And sometimes a good opinion is really constructive and is really helpful. But when you don't have any skin in the game, when it's not your house, when it's not your responsibility, sometimes you just have to let people just make their own decisions. You have to let people make their own choices, and sometimes your opinion just simply doesn't matter. And that's something that it's easy for people to overlook. It's easy for people nowadays to not even realize. You think that the world revolves around you, and you're like, when you kind of realize that it doesn't, it's like, it's wow. And it's actually relieving, because it's stressful to be only focused on yourself. If you're only focused on yourself, you're missing out on a lot of life, a lot of joy, a lot of real peace and comfort and enjoyment, when you can let go and just kind of know what's important. It's freeing. It's very freeing. Where was I going? Oh, okay. I was getting off on science. I liked how Kuhn, one of the things he described it as, is he described when scientists are in this normal science, and they're in this stage of fitting a paradigm. He called it puzzle solvers. They're focused on fitting the data to the paradigm, and how does it work in? What can explain this? What can explain that? And how does those fit? And it's an important stage. It's not, he wasn't belittling or being derogatory at all. It was just like, that's kind of what it is. And it was interesting. It was pointed out, I don't remember if Kuhn said it or if the one professor I had said it, but a lot of times it takes somebody who didn't come up in a science field to see something in a different perspective, and that pushes that science field out of its own paradigm, and that helps it enter into this state of revolution where it's, oh no, it's kind of chaos again, and people and scientists are trying to figure out what is an appropriate paradigm. It's been interesting to see. There's a, and I'm no expert on this, but I've done a decent bit of research on stuff like string theory versus quantum physics versus Einsteinian physics. And there's these string theory, really, it gets made fun of in the sense that there's no it hasn't done anything, but the math is just so elegant and it's so pretty, and it's so, if they can figure out how to fit it, if they can figure out, and if I remember correctly, it's been a few months since I've looked into it the last time, but it seems like the thing that they're trying to find is a gravity particle, and if they can figure out gravity itself, that's another one. Like, we talk about gravity as if we understand it, or electricity as if we understand it, or magnetics as if we understand these things. We can understand how they work a bit. We can understand what's going on. We can understand how to control them, but there's so many times we don't understand why. Like, we don't understand why. If you say, well, why? Like, I remember I was having this conversation with a buddy of mine, and I was like, I brought up magnets, and he's like, well, obviously we know exactly how they work. It's negative and positive polarization, and it's like, but why does that attract, or why does that repel? Why? And it's like, oh, it's because it's negative and positive. There comes a point where you make an assumption. You make an assumption, and the question is, how far are you going to go with that assumption? How far are you going to get before you make that assumption, and how deep does it go? And eventually you're going to have to make an assumption. That's just part of our perspective, like how much we can tell, how much we can see, how much data we can collect. We're going to have to make assumptions where we can't see or find or figure out. Yeah, excuse me. Well, I probably can go on out of this a bit. No, 37 minutes. That's kind of a long time, but I've got a list up here of different topics that I eventually would like to talk about. AI and climate change were just the ones on the top of the list, and it was just kind of interesting. I wasn't planning on talking about. There's one other thing that Kuhn brings up that I think is really important, and it's just this idea. It helps with this idea of paradigm. So there's an experiment called the Tower experiment, and before it was generally accepted that the Earth was round, they used this experiment to prove that the Earth was flat. So here's how the experiment works. You take, let's see where my hands are in the camera. You can see one of my hands. Okay. So you take the Earth, right? If you have a tower that's built on the Earth, and you climb to the top of the tower, and you drop a stone, well, while the Earth is spinning, this tower is moving. So if you drop a stone, that Earth will have rotated underneath that stone because it's no longer touching the tower, you're no longer holding it, and it'll land. And they could mathematically prove that this distance between the base of the tower and where the tower lands should be different. And it sounds like it makes sense. If the Earth is moving and the tower is moving and you drop the stone, well, you're not holding the stone anymore, so it's in free fall. And the Earth should move behind it, or it should move underneath it, and it should land further away from the tower. A little tickle in my throat. But, so it makes sense, and that was a conclusive proof that the Earth is not round. and that's what was used, and it was supported, and it was very hard to argue, because it's clear, like, okay, the earth moved, why would the stone land right next to the earth, Well, not until Newton came up with his idea of inertia was this experiment refuted. Now, Galileo, he came up with an idea where he tried to explain it, but he couldn't articulate it. It's from what I remember, and the way he would try to explain it is, if you have a carriage that's going, I should probably go from this side. If you have a carriage that's going on the ground, and it's going this traveling at a certain speed, and you drop a stone off of that carriage, that stone doesn't land where you dropped it, it lands further down. And that was his explanation, but he didn't know how to explain it. Newton explained it perfectly when he said an object in motion tends to stay in motion until acted upon by an equal and opposite force. Whatever his law is. But what that idea illustrates is, because this tower is, it's rotating on the earth, but because it's rotating, the stone is rotating too. So the stone doesn't just have down thrust, it has the rotational thrust that was already on the tower. So the stone will actually rotate with the earth and land directly next to the tower. They didn't have that concept of inertia before when they used the tower experiment as a proof against the earth being round. Again, we have a assumption, we have a experiment, we have well-reasoned people that were not dumb, they were not ignorant. Well, they were ignorant of inertia, but they weren't. They were the scientific minds, and they were just trying to fit the world to the paradigm that they saw, and because they didn't form the idea of inertia, because they hadn't had that articulated yet, it was considered by many to be a proof against the earth being round. It's an interesting thing, but the fact of the matter is, you don't know what you don't know, and it's kind of cliche to say, but it's still true. I mean, you have no idea of knowing what you don't know. I've really liked, and I haven't read The Black Swan yet by Nissam Taleb, I think is his name, but I'm most of the way through Anti-Fragile, and he talks about he's referenced his book The Black Swan, and from the gist of what I've gotten so far is that the black swan is how there's random events that you just can't predict, and you can prepare for randomness that you can't predict, but you can't predict it. So you just it looks like insanity to prepare for something that nobody else sees or understands, but when you prepare for it, you become like it's called a black swan. It's just something that you can't predict. It's actual randomness. And randomness it's difficult, it's hard. But I really like that story of the tower experiment, because it's just so clear to show how we can make assumptions that are reasoned. We can actually get to logical conclusions and still be wrong. We have to be very careful, and we have to look and investigate what are our assumptions. Where are we making an assumption? And I believe that not only in the scientific realm, but in the religious realm, like in a religious sense, in a spiritual sense, where is the assumption? And with me, I think it's so important to be able to pray, and to be able to pray and ponder and think and listen and feel the Holy Ghost inside. Feel that Spirit that comes from God and Christ. And And you have to be careful in what you make your assumptions, because when you trust in people, when you trust on man, when you trust in anything but that Christ, you got to be very careful, very careful. And that's one of the things that I get frustrated with when I see people who idolize these celebrities, or idolize these people in Hollywood, or idolize even your neighbors, or people that are good people. Be careful with idols. You don't want to put anything above God. God is he's one of the values that we used to hold in our country and in Western society is God King, or God Family King, or I don't remember how it is, but basically it had three references, and God was the first, family was one of them, and the country was another. If I remember right, I'm probably getting something wrong. I usually do, but that's the sentiment is still the same. You got to put God first, and that's in your life. That's even in your marriage and in your family. When I found my wife and we talked before we were married, we both agreed, and we both put God first, and He helps us come closer to each other. The closer we get to Him, the easier it is to be close as a husband and wife. And it's freeing. It's good stuff. It's easy to overlook. And now we've got 4 kids that are little monsters we just love to death. It's so fun. We're living the dream, man. We're living the dream. There's a guy that I work with that it was funny. I would ask him for probably 3 years. I would walk by him just about every day, and I'd be like, "Hey, what's up, Casey?" And he'd just be like, "Living the dream, man. Living the dream." And it's true. When you got your family, when you're honest with the people around you, when you're not hiding who you are, you're not being dishonest, you're not trying to harm others, you're being good and treating others well, and standing up for what's right. It's just like, there's a peace that comes in Christ, and you can't find it elsewhere. Well, rock the party. Oh, I should put up. I'm gonna copy these. There's a few other YouTube clips that I was gonna copy that had. So this one's a guy that did a TED talk on artificial intelligence. This talk that he did was that's the place that I heard of the network that was a dog that actually ended up being trained incorrectly, and that was the first place I'd heard of it, and I did a little bit of reading on it for when I heard that. And this was, I think his TED Talk was back in 2017, so it's not there has been more stuff there is more recent stuff, but it's kind of interesting. And the last one is something from Anomaly. Anomaly's a YouTuber guy. He does hip hop and stuff like that, but he does news, and it's just him, a single guy. I don't know if he's single like himself, but he's just a guy that's doing he does news, and he gives a refreshing perspective on it. I've come to trust very little in news and media figures, whether that's mainstream, it doesn't matter where it's from, but when they're sponsored, it's hard to know, and it's hard to discern what is motivated through sponsorship. Not saying that there's people, like, I'm not saying that anybody who's sponsored is evil or is bad, but it does always make you wonder, like, there's that conflict of interests. Sometimes if news is reported that it conflicts with what the sponsors want, is that going to get reported fairly? And that's one of the things I really like about Anomaly, and about most of the news places where I get my news is independent. And and I don't just get them from one source. You get them from multiple sources that have multiple opinions, because that's, I think, the best way to get a broad range of information, so that you can make somewhat informed and somewhat intelligent decisions based off of a broad perspective. Perspective is a big deal to me. That's one of the things that I love reading books and storybooks. When I was a kid, before I could read very well, I watched my older siblings play Final Fantasy VII, and man, we loved that game. It was interesting. My dad, so we had in our living room, we had a little like a nightstand type thing, and the TV was on this nightstand. We had a PlayStation inside the top drawer. Yeah, inside the top drawer of that nightstand. Well, my dad, he thought we were playing it too much, and so he put a padlock on the side of that nightstand. Well, my brother, that was my oldest brother, he took out the bottom drawer. He broke the railing off of that. He broke the railing off of that top drawer, and so we could twist out the drawer enough to reach in and grab a controller and put the controller away and close it, and so we could still play. And I would watch them. My brothers would have me stay in the hallway, and if my parents woke up and came to check on us, I would have to run and tell my brothers, and we would all hide, and turn the TV off real quick before before we were caught, and then we would play late into the night. And I couldn't read fast enough to tell what the story was going on, but I was captivated by this story. And just since then, I've loved just storybooks. And as I matured in my just in who I am, I found myself gravitating to stories that could get you to see the world in a different perspective. If there's something in a story that gets you to look at the world in a way that you haven't yet thought of it, there's a value to that. And that's something that there's also danger in that, in the sense that sometimes you can skew your perspective by going down these rabbit holes that are like, you got to be careful. So you always want to distrust everything, your mind especially. But there's a value in seeing a new perspective. It helps you to either change your current perspective to be better, or it helps you to understand why your current perspective is strong or is good. And if you haven't seen the world in multiple perspectives, if you're only looking through the current lens that you see the world, you're going to be missing out on, at the very least, information, but also experience. Experience is you're not gonna have the understanding of why your opinion is either right or wrong, or you're not going to be exposed to opinions that help your opinion get better. And it's just one of those things. There's no substitute for experience. Rock the party. Goodbye.